Chapter 6 Dream Teams for Ethical Nightmares. The Ethical Nightmare Challenge is a fundamentally different approach to addressing the potential nightmares of AI. It's not just another framework or list of best practices. The world needs exactly 0 more of those. To wit, the Georgetown University-based Center for Security and Emerging Technology released a report in September of 2025 titled Harmonizing AI Guidance, Distilling Voluntary Standards and Best Practices into a Unified Framework. It comes with 58 recommendations across 34 topic areas distilled from 52 different sources. There's a lot of fantastic information in there, but please, make it stop. What frameworks like the ones reviewed and offered in that report don't tell you is who should do what, when they should do it, and how they should do it. There's no guidance on how to implement all of the recommendations, let alone how to do so at scale in a timely fashion, nor how to update practices as the technology continues to evolve. Their recommendations require significant organizational change with no sense of how big the lift is, how to pull it off, or what the probability is of failure. Nor is there any kind of ranking on how to assess what to tackle first and/or how to prioritize everything else. This is precisely where the Ethical Nightmare Challenge comes in. It's not only a framework, it's a method that is outcome-oriented. We need a clear sense of the desired outcome to define what success and failure looks like. Readily deployable. We can't wait months, let alone years, to implement nightmare avoidance strategies. Dynamic and easy to update. We can't adopt a rigid solution that can't adapt to technological, regulatory, and organizational changes. Efficient. We can't allow the solution to be delayed due to bottlenecks nor become the bottleneck itself. Conducive to communication and collaboration across all levels of an organization. We can't allow the solution to ignore the vast network of team interdependencies that characterize agentic AI. At the core of the Ethical Nightmare Challenge as method is the seeding and spreading of loosely networked ENC teams. ENC teams are created on an as-needed basis throughout the organization. All teams use the same methods for nightmare avoidance. To get a grip on what this looks like and why the Ethical Nightmare Challenge method satisfies all 5 of the above criteria, we'll look at ENC teams at 3 different levels of the organization: the project or AI solution level, the department level, and the C-suite or board level. We'll start in the middle and work our way out. I'll explain how these teams operate, what tools they need, and how this approach solves our problems. 3 types of ENC teams. The ENC method has 7 steps. Here they are at a high level. Step 1, create an ENC team. Step 2, ensure baseline knowledge of AI ethical risks and the ENC method. Step 3, identify and score AI ethical nightmares. Step 4, identify needed resources and training to avoid those nightmares. Step 5, assign responsibilities for resource and training, creation, and delivery. Step 6, assess progress. Step 7, repeat as needed. As we'll see, this method is used by every team, regardless of whether they operate at the enterprise, department or division, or AI project level. That kind of methodological consistency in how AI nightmares are avoided translates to ease of communication and collaboration across the enterprise from top to bottom. Let's see how. ENC team number 1, department level. A VP of marketing for a Fortune 500 company is keen on scaling AI within her division, but she wants to ensure that things don't go sideways. Time for the ENC method. Step 1, create the ENC team. The marketing VP creates a team, including but not limited to the members of her division. She will include those with traditional marketing experience, as well as at least one technologist that is familiar with technical measures for AI risk mitigation, and a technologist, it may be the same person, who is a project leader on AI marketing solutions. She may also include members from other departments, such as someone from product, someone from operations, perhaps a VP of marketing for a division other than her own. She is the ENC team leader. How long does it take to create a team? We're talking about a week or 2. Send some emails or Slack messages, get on the phone, hop on a video call. You're looking for 5 to 8 people, 12 max, since more than that is not only overkill, it slows down efficient meetings. Step 2, ensure baseline knowledge of AI ethical risks and the ENC method. The ENC team leader confirms the team is trained on the basics of the ethical risks of AI, for example, the kind of information articulated in chapters 1 through 3, the basics of the Ethical Nightmare Challenge method and associated tools. More on this below. In some cases, this kind of basic training will have been already provided. In others, an ENC team leader will have to ensure that team members get the requisite training. This training can be done in person or asynchronously, or a combination of the two. In my experience, if the training programs are ready, My firm offers asynchronous training for both the basics of the ethical risks of AI and the basics of ENC. Giving people around 2 weeks to complete the training is enough. Give them much more time, and procrastination gives way to forgetting about it altogether. Give them less, and people can't find the time in their schedules. The key here is that baseline training is relatively brief, about an hour, so there's no large upfront commitment that stands as a blocker to participation. Step 3. Identify and score AI ethical nightmares. The ENC team answers the first question of the Ethical Nightmare Challenge. What are the marketing department's ethical nightmares pertaining to our current and near future use of AI? There are a variety of ways to answer this question. The team may do a whiteboarding or brainstorming session. They may, although I would rather burn in hell for eternity, write ideas on sticky notes they affix to a wall. They can contribute ideas in a shared doc asynchronously and then discuss live. They can even use an LLM as a sounding board and idea generator. But whatever they do, the team better not spend time creating an attractive PowerPoint presentation summarizing all of it. I'm begging you. In this context, functional and efficient beats beautiful every time. It's important to note 2 related ideas here. First, remember that some potential nightmares are built into AI, the ones we discussed in Chapter 1, such as bias, privacy violations, hallucinations, and automation bias, and Chapter 3, such as snowball effects or cascading failures, emergent or systemic risks, and autonomy. ENC teams would do well to start there. Second, ENC teams need not only think about what the nightmares are, but also consider their sources. How might the department accidentally release marketing material with hallucinated content about a product? How might the department inadvertently release racist imagery while A/B testing with AI-generated content? And so on. Listing potential nightmares and their sources is one thing. Prioritizing them is another. Thus, their next task is to give each nightmare a nightmare score. There are a variety of ways to do this as well, the most basic being assigning a numerical score to the probability of the nightmare becoming a reality, and the severity of the impact were that nightmare to become reality. High probability of hallucinating diagnosis in oncology ward equals high nightmare score. Low probability of causing mental distress due to a plethora of options in e-commerce equals low nightmare score. I recommend to all clients that they first brainstorm potential ethical nightmares and subsequently assign nightmare scores. Otherwise, one person may raise a potential nightmare, another person says, yeah, but that's so unlikely, and then they're off on a different conversation. That conversation needs to be had, but not yet. First, just get the nightmares on the table. Score afterward. Depending on the complexity of the AI under discussion, this can take anywhere from 30 minutes to a few hours, usually spread across a handful of meetings. Step 4. Identify needed resources and training to avoid those nightmares. Now that the team has AI ethical nightmares and nightmare scores, it's time for the next 2 questions of the ENC. What resources does the marketing department have to avoid those nightmares? What kind of training do marketing personnel need so they can use those resources effectively? This is a collaborative problem-solving process. The ENC team is thinking through how they currently handle issues, what tools they already have at their disposal, who they may reach out to within the organization that may have experience with this sort of thing, what governance structures and guidance already exist, where, when, and how they can best communicate information to various stakeholders, and so on. This isn't compliance, let alone compliance theater. To repeat the already italicized idea above, and I'll italicize it again for super emphasis, this is collaborative, cross-functional problem solving. I want to be clear about what problem the ENC team is solving. This is at the department level, so they are not themselves building AI solutions. The department is the organizing and governing structure under which AI project teams build AI solutions, where those solutions could lead to ethical nightmares for the department. In thinking about what's needed, they're asking, what resources and/or training can we provide our AI project teams with so that they'll avoid the identified ethical nightmares? It may well be that certain rules or departmental policy will be of help, but a policy is only one tool among many for nightmare avoidance. There are loads of possibilities here. The ENC team may create weekly sessions in which project leaders exchange experiences and ideas about how they engage in ethical nightmare avoidance on their projects. Or maybe once a month a newsletter is sent out to all project leaders or everyone in the department to tell the story of one particularly clever and/or impactful nightmare avoidance strategy an AI project team successfully executed. Or maybe it explains how a nightmare avoidance strategy failed and reviews the lessons learned. The ENC team is a problem solver, not a god atop Mount Olympus hurling commandments to the mortals. Its workings enable AI project leaders and their teams to do their best in problem solving for the AI solution they're working on. More about this soon. It's also worth highlighting that at least one member of this team is an AI project leader in the marketing department. That person should have enough on the ground experience to meaningfully contribute to conversations about what may plausibly not work for project leaders across the department. This is one reason why cross functional membership of the ENC team is so important. We're not being inclusive for the sake of virtue signaling. We're being inclusive because we need the insights of different people on the team if we're going to engage in efficient and effective problem solving. How long this step takes depends on the size of the department and the kind of AI it uses or will use soon. Once again, 30 minutes to a few hours is about right. Step 5. Assign responsibilities for resource and training, creation, and delivery. The ENC team identifies who will own the various initiatives related to the resources and/or training that needs to be developed and delivered. Target dates for rollout and completion of those initiatives will also be set. Suppose, for instance, the ENC team concludes in step 3 that, among other things, a major source of its ethical nightmares is simply for marketing employees to be ignorant of the ways in which marketing content can become biased if left to an AI alone. After all, if employees don't know what AI disasters they must avoid, and they regularly use AI, you've got dangerous employees on your hands. In step 3, this is determined to be a high priority, and the ENC team's plan is to run an AI ethical nightmare awareness campaign within the marketing department. They have also decided that they want 95% of marketing employees to be aware of the ethical nightmares of AI by the close of the next quarter. They think that's a sufficient threshold for blocking off this path to an ethical nightmare. That campaign can take a variety of forms depending on how the department operates. It can be anywhere from formal training to a meeting that managers have with their direct reports to AI-generated videos that are sent around via email. Success can be measured in a variety of ways, ranging from the percentage of marketing employees who have received formal training, to those that attended a meeting in which their team leader discussed ethical nightmares, to the percentage of employees who viewed the entirety of the AI-generated videos, to surveys distributed to targeted subsets of employees. If it's not already obvious, there isn't one right way to do this. Finally, in step 5, the ENC team puts a particular person in charge of the ethical nightmare awareness campaign and identifies target rollout and completion dates. How long does it take to assign these responsibilities? I don't know, 15, 20 minutes? It should be clear who does what, given the resources that need to be created and the role and responsibilities of those on the ENC team. You're not going to tell someone in operations to add an adapter to a generative AI, after all. Step 6. Assess progress. At the appropriate times, as determined in advance by the ENC team leader with the advice of members, the ENC team meets to assess their progress. What you're looking for here is whether the resources and/or additional training sufficiently lower the probability of the ethical nightmare occurring. After all, you can't change the severity of it, but you can reduce the likelihood, which in turn reduces the nightmare score. If, for instance, you relied on people watching a 20-minute video and only 10% of people did, it may be that people weren't sufficiently aware of the video, or was bad, or you failed to communicate how important it was that people watch it. As such, the likelihood of the ethical nightmare hasn't been sufficiently reduced. Should you abandon the video or double down? That's a team decision. Step 6 is complete once it's been decided whether the nightmare scores are low enough to proceed, or if resources and/or training need to be refined and/or added. In some cases, if the nightmare score is too high and the resources aren't available to reduce them, putting the project on pause is the not reckless move. Assessing progress shouldn't take very long since it's primarily a matter of revising the earlier likelihood score. And if you've done a good job defining what a successful resource looks like during step 4, it's all the easier. The time-consuming part isn't the team meetings, it's creating the resources and/or training needed to avoid ethical nightmares. That's as it should be. Less time talking, more time doing. Step 7. Repeat as needed. At appropriate times, the marketing ENC team leader determines whether repeating the earlier steps is warranted. What are appropriate times? This can be defined formally or informally. Formal would entail that it occurs on a regularly scheduled basis, such as biannually, annually, etc. In those cases, the ENC team would reconvene and assess the state of the division in relation to its present and near future use of AI, as well as the state of AI progress more generally. If nothing has happened, there are no new kinds of AI, there are no new ethical nightmares, there are no new ways of realizing familiar nightmares, there are no relevant personnel changes, etc., that can be determined in short order. The team may decide that there's no need to re-perform the ethical nightmare challenge, and they disband until the next scheduled time. If something has happened, a new bias or hallucination mitigation tool has been invented that would help all project teams, a new powerful AI marketing tool has been released, then checking to see whether current resources and training are still adequate or whether updates are needed is warranted. The informal way of doing this entails no scheduled, predetermined times when the ENC team reconvenes. Instead, members of the team, including but not limited to the leader, may realize changes afoot and/or see things on the ground that indicate taking the ethical nightmare challenge again is called for, or should at least be considered. For instance, the AI project leader on the team may have seen firsthand that certain resources or knowledge is consistently absent in the projects he leads. He also knows he's not the only one. Colleagues who are also project leaders are noticing the same thing. At that point, he may talk to, email, text, Slack, whatever, the ENC team leader to tell her it's time to get the gang back together. His on the ground experience helps the leader understand the needs of the division. The formal and informal approaches are compatible. An organization can allow for both scheduled meetings plus ad hoc meetings when the ENC team leader thinks it's warranted based on talking to other members of the team. I'm not interested in getting too prescriptive here. Throughout these steps, you may have noticed the process is oriented around avoiding defined, ethically, reputationally, legally bad outcomes. Readily actionable. It does not depend upon a drawn-out design phase. The ENC team is getting to work as fast as reasonably possible. The biggest obstacle is relatively small: basic training on AI nightmares and the ENC process. Adaptable to advances in AI and changes in regulatory context. Whatever comes down the line, the operating model remains constant. Not dependent on clearing a bottleneck, nor does the process become a bottleneck itself. The marketing department doesn't need to wait for enterprise-wide policy or guidance. Remember what I was screaming in the introduction? There's also nothing that would require them to become a bottleneck, which would become even clearer as we consider the next ENC team. Conducive to communication and collaboration across the organization. It includes a VP of marketing, who reports to perhaps the enterprise-wide CMO or the COO, direct reports of the VP, a VP of marketing from another division, a project leader, a data scientist or two, and so on. We're at the starting point of creating a web. When you add up all the time it takes to engage in the process, not counting the time it takes to develop the right resources and/or training, we're talking about something that takes weeks or a few months to implement, not years. Yes, building things takes time, and there's nothing one can do about that. But going from zero to having effectively implemented AI ethical nightmare avoidance in a few months is a game changer compared to the C-suite bottleneck years-long standard approach. This ENC team exists somewhere in the middle of the organization. It's within marketing only, so it's more vertical than horizontal. In fact, if it's one division among, say, 4 marketing divisions, it's a narrow vertical band. But if that division covers the most important suite of products within the company, this ENC team packs a powerful punch. From here, let's go deeper into the division, to the project level, after which we'll head back upstairs to the C-suite and board. ENC team number 2, AI project level. Imagine a project leader for an agentic AI. And let's say he's in the marketing department as well. He knows enough about AI risks to realize that he needs to take the ethical nightmare challenge. However, the marketing department ENC team we just discussed either doesn't exist yet or they're in the middle of their own work. They won't be of great help. What does he do? He follows exactly the same process as ENC team number 1. It's worth repeating it here. Step 1, create the AI project level ENC team. Step 2, ensure baseline knowledge of AI ethical risks and the ENC method. Step 3, identify and score project-specific AI ethical nightmares. Step 4, identify needed resources and training to avoid those nightmares. Step 5, assign responsibilities for resource and training creation and delivery. Step 6, assess progress. Step 7, repeat as needed. Because at this level we're more focused on developers and end users, it's critical to highlight the importance of the cross-functionality of the ENC team. It's also worth noting that the resources and training we're identifying at this level may be for the project team and/or end users of the solution. The data scientists will see technical sources of nightmares and technical resources needed to mitigate those risks. The marketer will have insight into sources of nightmares related to how consumers behave, to which engineers may be blind. In some cases, the technical source of the risk may be a non-technical solution. For instance, given that hallucinations are inevitable, and there's only so much data scientists can do to decrease them, the nightmares that may result must be mitigated in a non-technical way. Non-technical mitigation examples might include training end users to be sensitive to hallucinations and understanding when fact-checking is crucial and who should conduct it. In other cases, nightmares may manifest via consumer behavior and preferences. A generative AI that creates racially offensive images is a marketer's nightmare for which, at least in some cases, there will be technical fixes. And in still other cases, there will be a mix of technical and non-technical ways to avoid the nightmares. What enables this motley crew to work together? They're speaking the same language, the language of nightmares. And each member understands that different members of the team have different superpowers that enable them to see nightmares they may not have seen themselves and to deploy resources that they may not have known about or had authority to use. We are creating a web of technologists and non technologists who collaboratively identify and avoid AI ethical nightmares at the project level. People who serve on these ENC teams will, of course, also be great members of department and even enterprise wide ENC teams. Throughout these steps, you may have noticed all the things we noticed about ENC team number 1. It is outcome oriented, readily actionable, adaptable to AI advances in regulatory contexts, and isn't dependent on or a source of bottlenecks. It's true that this ENC team would benefit from existing inside a division that has taken the ethical nightmare challenge, but they don't need it to get to work. In fact, perhaps this is the department's first significant use of AI outside of Copilot. Perhaps this team exists inside a startup that lacks robust departments, or the marketing department is literally one person. The ENC team approach works all the same at the project level. Let me repeat the benefit of having a department or division, not just project teams, engage in the ENC, and what this says about the essential function of departments in this context. The department level ENC is there to create the resources and the environment of trained personnel so that project leaders engaged in ENC efforts can be more successful. Department ENC teams are engaged in capacity building. They are not, or at least not primarily, creating rigid rules or commandments. They are not providing SOPs with which they expect compliance. They are giving their teams the resources they need to responsibly develop and use AI at scale. Okay, back in the elevator, heading up. ENC team number 3, the board and C-suite. I think you already know what's coming. This is the same 7-step process the department engaged in. This is, after all, one reason the ENC is so effective. Its portability. And just as the department has the function of enabling project leaders and employees rise to the ethical nightmare challenge, the C-suite and board has the function of helping departments rise to the ethical nightmare challenge. Again, this is not, or not primarily, issuing edicts from atop Mount Olympus. This is enabling departments and divisions to avoid their respective nightmares, which in turn enables their project leaders to avoid their nightmares. There is, however, one place they need to focus that departments do not: the ethical nightmares that arise due to interdependencies and breaks in the system. It's one thing for marketing or HR or finance to work within the departments and avoid ethical nightmares. It's another when AI travels across departmental boundaries, leading to sources of risk that result from breakdowns in communication and/or collaboration. Some of the key questions that enterprise-wide ENC teams need to answer include: what ethical nightmares could result from breakdowns within and across divisions of the enterprise? What resources do they need to increase cross-department and division communication and collaboration? What sort of training do they need to use those resources effectively? The need to answer these questions echoes something we saw on the department ENC team. The board or C-suite level team needs to include people who can help them solve their problems, including division heads, ideally those who have participated in and/or led ENC teams themselves, as well as AI project leaders who can help senior executives see what's happening on the ground and what plausible solutions look like. As for when and how often this senior executive team should take the ethical nightmare challenge, we have the same formal and informal approaches we saw with department ENC teams. ENC teams as emergency response. ENC teams are focused on nightmare avoidance, but one of the lessons we learned in our travels from narrow through generative and to agentic/clusterfuck AI is that there is so much unpredictability. Nor can we wrap our heads around all the various interdependencies of the complex software ecosystems that constitute agentic AI. This leads us to the unsettling conclusion that bad things will happen. We saw a glimpse of this in Chapter 4, where I quoted General McChrystal's team of teams. Airplanes have become so complex, with so many interdependent parts, that it's impossible to predict all the things that could go wrong, let alone devise procedures for dealing with each one of those problems. Or to take another example from his book, quote, "A checklist is inadequate for surgery because of the quintillions of possibilities that interdependence generates. We would never call the rigors of medical school easy, but it is more feasible to spend 7 years learning about the complex cause and effect relationships in the human body than to attempt to record and memorize every possible event that can befall bodies." End quote. This shouldn't lead us to despair. It just means we need to place a great deal of weight on incident detection. Monitoring the AI and responding appropriately in a timely fashion is crucial. This means there are 2 additional tasks a project-level ENC team should engage in. First, As part of the resources they create to avoid potential nightmares, they should create and/or identify what resources will be used to detect ethical nightmares beginning to unfold. For this solution, they should ask themselves, what are the red lights we have to install for when things start breaking, preferably before a crash? Second, they should at least be part of, if not lead, incident response measures if the detection comes too late and/or it wasn't spotted at all. They are, after all, project-specific subject matter experts in what ethical nightmares had previously been identified and what resources have already been deployed to avoid them. They are in the best position of anyone to identify appropriate solutions to an emerging ethical AI nightmare. Tools for teams. I've articulated 7 steps ENC teams take to carry out their respective missions, but we need to add more to this structure. While it is true that everyone engaging in those steps does a tremendous amount to fuel communication and collaboration, we need more. More specifically, we need them using similar tools to create greater consistency in how ethical AI nightmares are identified, scored, and prioritized. There are 3 such tools worth emphasizing. The first tool is simply a brief questionnaire, primarily completed by the potential ENC team leader, as to whether an ENC team should be created in the first place. This will depend on several factors, including a general sense of what's at stake if things go wrong. These questions can be customized in various ways, but here are 5 good candidates to start with. Does this AI make decisions that could significantly affect the well-being of our customers or clients and/or employees and/or our investors? Could it potentially violate their rights? Could failure create significant reputational, legal, or financial consequences? Or more specifically, could failure lead to a loss of X amount of dollars or more? Does this AI cross departmental boundaries or touch sensitive data? Is this a new type of AI for our organization? How bad would it be if this AI manifested the familiar AI ethical risks, such as those related to bias, privacy violations, and hallucinations? Once again, organizations can be formal or informal about this. A formal approach would be something like, if 2 or more questions receive a yes, an ENC team should be formed. The informal approach would be closer to, leaders are expected to answer these questions as best they can and make their best professional judgment as to why those answers indicate the need or not for an ENC team. Formal or informal, the results of the questionnaire should be documented. The second tool helps the ENC leader think about who should be on the team. Strict criteria are not necessary. Instead, the goal is to use questions that enable the ENC leader to exercise their professional judgment in an informed way. It's worth highlighting here that ENC leaders do not and, in some cases, should not, restrict membership to employees. Having a member from the company from whom they are licensing an AI, say a data scientist from OpenAI or Google or Microsoft or Anthropic, etc., can be an extremely useful addition. Similarly, if, say, a project-level ENC team is building an AI solution for a client, having people from the client side serve on the ENC team is, all else equal, a great idea. The third and perhaps most important tool helps the ENC team at each part of the 7-step method. In my practice, we provide clients with enterprise, department, and project ENC team worksheets that guide and document the 7 steps they take. Because each worksheet is nearly identical in structure, anyone who has seen one ENC worksheet can pick up a second one from another team, regardless of where that team sits in the organizational hierarchy, and immediately understand what they're looking at. A C-suite executive or board director, for instance, if they've served on an ENC team, can pick up the ENC worksheet of a particular AI project and readily interpret what ethical nightmares were identified, how they were scored, what resources were developed, etc. Crucially, when the same methods and tools are used across enterprise, department, and project teams, a great deal is done to facilitate communication. What's more, consistency in method, tools, and documentation makes for straightforward ways to conduct assessments of how well your ENC teams are doing the jobs they are intended to do. ENC teams in bloom. Each ENC team has marching orders by which they carry out their respective missions, no matter what level of the organization they operate at. The teams themselves foster communication and collaboration across the organization by virtue of the membership being composed of diverse members of the organization. What's more, as ENC teams form and disband and form again as needed, and as different ENC teams have different members, each ENC team is a locus of cross-functional and cross-departmental communication and collaboration. Each ENC team is itself a web of interconnectivity, and as the ENC teams increase in number over months and years, the interconnectivity of all those people across all those teams increases as well. We're not just building nightmare avoidance solutions, we're building an organizational capacity and a culture of nightmare avoidance. But it doesn't stop there. The interconnectivity doesn't only exist within teams, but across the teams themselves. Suppose, for instance, the C-suite ENC team understands it needs to create the means by which departments collaborate so that nothing falls between the cracks. They may be concerned that AI agents in different departments may act in an uncoordinated way, leading to snowball effects or cascading failures, and systemic or emergent risks. They want to coordinate interdepartmental means of communication and collaboration about AI ethical nightmares so that interdepartmental AI agents can communicate and collaborate without ethical nightmares rearing their heads. Maybe they create opportunities, for example, a workshop or a discussion forum, for ENC leaders of different departments and or divisions to share what they've learned, where they succeeded, where they failed, and so forth. Here's how we avoided this nightmare. We're not sure how to avoid this other one, though. Any ideas or experience with this? Or perhaps the C-suite creates an interdepartmental ENC SWAT team that starts by asking, what are the ethical nightmares that could emerge from these different agents interacting across all these departments? What cross-departmental resources can we use to avoid those ethical nightmares? What training will people need to use those resources effectively? That ENC SWAT team would surely have ENC project leaders of those agents included in the team. The C-suite may provide other common resources that all ENC teams can pull from, like an organization-specific ethical AI nightmare inventory or nightmare avoidance strategies that teams have found particularly useful and applicable in multiple scenarios. Similarly, a department-level ENC team may provide a resource by which project-level ENC teams can learn about the latest in nightmare identification and avoidance, given changing technology and advances in research. At the core of the standard approach is compliance with stale policies. At the core of the ENC Teams approach is a culture and practice of dynamic, collaborative problem solving. There's no real choice here. Start forming your ENC teams. Chapter 7, ENC, an approach so flexible it makes Simone Biles look like C-3PO. One lesson we've learned is that AI, especially agentic AI, is built and modified by dozens and maybe even hundreds of teams across multiple organizations. If we're to avoid AI's ethical nightmares, we need to do our best to make communication and collaboration across these teams as easy as possible. What's more, since there are so many teams using so many different AIs throughout a single company, getting everyone to think about, talk about, and address ethical nightmares in the same way is crucial. As General McChrystal put it in Team of Teams, we want all these different people to manifest a, quote, shared consciousness. Consistent, simple messaging and consistent practices are thus keystones in the overall nightmare avoidance endeavor. Get it wrong, have people speaking different languages and engaging in fundamentally different practices, and you'll have chaos. Given this, and despite my being generally allergic to rules and discipline, I was once fired for insubordination as a lifeguard, I must insist on some requirements for how an organization rises to the ethical nightmare challenge. At the same time, I'm not interested in being a dictator. Some aspects of how to create and implement ENC teams are your call. You know your organization, you know your company, you know better than I do what will work there. In this chapter, I'll lay out what's negotiable and what's non-negotiable when adopting the ethical nightmare challenge. And for all you top-down governance people wondering how all this relates to you and your work, and am I seriously and recklessly suggesting we don't need robust corporate governance because I'm a know-nothing and how dare I undermine your important work? And don't worry, I have something for you too. Hands off. Here are the things every organization should adhere to with draconian rigor when taking on the ethical nightmare challenge. The 3 questions. Everyone, board, C-suite, departments, project leaders, should all lead with the 3 questions. 1, what are ethical nightmares? 2, what resources do we need to avoid them? 3, how do we train our people to use those resources effectively? There's good reason you're seeing this repeatedly. Repetition creates habits, habits create culture. The repetition also speaks to how important it is to keep to this simple, universal approach to avoiding breakdowns in communication and thus collaboration. If you're in the C-suite and these questions are drilled into your head, and you know they're in your department and project leaders' heads, you know how to have the risk conversation. You ask them the 3 questions. They should have answers ready for you. In fact, they should be ready to share an ENC worksheet with you. If they don't have answers for how to avoid nightmares, you shouldn't sleep well. Suppose you're a project leader and you hear from your boss or read in an email or are told in the cafeteria line that executives are worried about some specific ethical nightmare, and so they've provided you with resources A and B and training modules X and Y to help you avoid those nightmares. You already have a mental model of how to take on this information. It's just of a piece with what you do with your team on a regular basis. You need to talk to a third-party vendor because you're in procurement? Ask them, we need you to answer these 3 questions. Please provide documentation for verification. That's how we do things here. You're a leader in HR and you brought in a new AI tool for HR personnel to use. You tell them how the builders of that tool, whether it was built in-house or procured from a third party, answer the three questions. Those people immediately understand what nightmares were identified, what resources are available for avoiding them, and whether they need any kind of training to use the tool or resources effectively. When the three questions are echoed here and there and everywhere by everyone, this does a tremendous amount to build consistency, mutual understanding, and thereby collaboration. You're not just giving instructions with which people must comply. You're giving everyone the simple and common framework they need to understand what's going on. You're building both an organizational capacity distributed across all employees and a culture that takes ethical nightmare avoidance seriously. The 7-step method. The three questions establish what questions need to be answered, and the 7-step method establishes how to answer those questions. Recall the 7 steps. Repetition creates habit. 1. Create an ENC team. 2. Ensure baseline knowledge of AI ethical risks and the ENC method. 3. Identify and score AI ethical nightmares. Step 4. Identify needed resources and training to avoid those nightmares. 5. Assign responsibilities for resources and training creation and delivery. 6. Assess progress. 7. Repeat as needed. I don't care if you're on the board or the chief information officer or the VP of marketing or the project lead for an agentic AI solution. If you don't follow these steps, I will strike down upon you with great vengeance and fury. Again, this consistency across teams makes communication and collaboration possible. If you've served on one ENC team, then you know how the second team will operate, and the third one, and so on. That holds if all 3 ENC teams you serve on are at the same level, or if they're at different levels of the organization. Suppose you're at the department level and you learn that an enterprise ENC team has made decisions that impact your department. You know, at the procedural level, how they came to those conclusions. You also know what success looks like, since nightmare scores have been identified and shared with you, and you know who owns the creation of the resources and delivery of the requisite training. Similarly, if you've just caught wind that there's an enterprise ENC team doing its work, you understand what they're doing and how they're doing it. This level of transparency and consistency plays a huge role in creating reliable and predictable ways of operating in a complex and turbulent environment. Cross-functional departmental membership. Okay, look, I'll be honest. Slogans like, "Our diversity is our strength," make me a bit nauseous. But don't get me wrong. Ethically speaking, it sounds mostly right, although I prefer the less pithy but more accurate, "Our diversity is one of our strengths alongside others." In the case of ENC teams, this is certainly true. There are, of course, different kinds of diversity. At a minimum, we need a diversity of expertise and business experience. ENC teams can't just be composed of engineers and data scientists, nor can they only be composed of people within one business function like HR or marketing. As explained in the previous chapter, different roles can see different nightmares and different ways of avoiding those nightmares. In most cases, nightmare avoidance will require a suite of technical and human-related tools, for example, a human or team in the loop. The product member of the ENC team may have product design modifications that will encourage certain user behaviors. The developer may have a way of tweaking the AI, such as adding an adapter. The marketing member may explain how this impacts how the product is advertised, and so on. Other kinds of diversity are helpful, if not extremely helpful. Many people will reasonably bristle at ENC teams that are demographically homogeneous. An ENC team of all middle-aged white men introduces the possibility, if not probability, of blind spots. That said, a team solely comprised of young Asian women will also introduce the possibility, if not probability, of a different set of blind spots. This constitutes strong reason to take great care in creating ENC teams, which brings us to the next non-negotiable: use of nearly identical tools and templates. There are 3 questions that specify what needs to be answered. Then there's the 7-step method that explains how to explain those answers. We also discussed who needs to engage in those 7 steps, but more must be standardized. Tools and templates are needed throughout the 7-step process. How to create teams, what baseline education about AI risks is delivered, how nightmare scores are determined and recorded, and so on. If you've seen one set of ENC-generated documents, you've seen them all, at least in terms of the structure of those documents. The content will vary, of course. This means that when an executive who serves on an enterprise ENC team looks at the materials generated by a project-level ENC team, she knows exactly what she's looking at. She sees how the team was formed. She sees how baseline knowledge was established. She sees the nightmare scores of various ethical nightmares that pertain to the project, and so on. She's accustomed to seeing nightmares of the enterprise as opposed to those of a particular project, but since she understands the structure, the content of the project-level ENC assessment is readily accessible. On the other hand, if different teams have different methods of nightmare avoidance and different methods for recording their efforts, a breakdown in communication, and thus chaos, will ensue. You do you. But again, I'm no king. There are all sorts of ways ENC teams can and should be bent without breaking. The ways they can bend constitute a strength. The adaptability of ENC teams is one of their greatest virtues, and the relentless morphing of the technological and regulatory landscape, of the ceaseless, tireless transmogrification of the AI industrial Okay, I'm getting carried away. Scope of risks. Throughout this book, I focused on ethical risks, although I've also mentioned reputational and legal risks. There is, of course, a Venn diagram that one could draw here, but must I? There are other risks one could incorporate into the responsibility of an ENC team. They could also consider cybersecurity or operational risks, for instance. After all, most responsible AI programs include commitments to security and privacy. For some organizations, including cyber risks within the scope of an ENC team makes a lot of sense. For others, not so much. One thing I've learned in my work with clients is that every company has its own quirks and features and particular weirdness. In some cases, my team and I were brought in by the Chief Information Officer or the CISO. In others, it was the Chief Compliance Officer or Director of Compliance for a division, and they and the cyber teams are siloed. They do their work, the cyber team does theirs, but there isn't much interaction between the two. In still other cases, we were brought in by people with titles like Global Head of Responsible AI, and their teams were not integrated closely with cybersecurity or compliance. Now, I could tell you what the ideal is. Everyone should work together and be integrated, and there should be no silos. But we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. If you're looking to create ENC teams, and you're the head of marketing, and you have very little interaction with the cyber folks, I wouldn't make it a requirement that the ENC team scope includes cyber risks. Start with the lightest political lift to get things started. As your AI risk practice matures, you can integrate cyber risks into your ENC team. On the other hand, if cyber teams are already well integrated with the work, then it makes sense to include them in the scope of ENC teams now. Content of regulatory and/or cultural standards. I've pointed out that nightmares vary across departments and roles. The ethical nightmares of the C-suite and board are different from those of HR, even if there's overlap. But of course, there are different ethical nightmares depending upon where the AI is deployed. Different markets have different regulatory standards. Different countries have different cultural standards. In identifying ethical nightmares, ENC teams can tailor those nightmares to where they operate. There might be some ethical nightmares that pertain to operating in France. They're a sensitive bunch, no? That doesn't apply to the US. There are regulations that apply in nanny state California that don't apply in kill or be killed Texas. ENC teams are not tied to specific procedures that relate to specific regulations. That's crucial, since the regulatory landscape is constantly shifting. An executive order in AI can be here one day and gone the next. In fact, that means ENC teams absolutely should not be tied to certain regulatory standards. They need to be adaptable to the changing environment, capable of recognizing that new regulations have come along to which they must adhere. They need to be quickly reactive to new requirements, not welded to existing rails. Kinds of technology. There's a giant AI on the cover of this book. I've prattled on endlessly about this AI and that AI, so yes, let's focus on AI ethical nightmares. But there's nothing built into the ENC method that says those teams are only allowed to focus on AI. As new technologies become relevant to an organization, it could be augmented and/or virtual reality, blockchain, quantum computers, and whatever they think of next. ENC teams are perfectly positioned to handle them. We don't have to go running back to the top-down, value-first standard approach that ends in a dead policy. Those technologies can be onboarded as quickly as it takes ENC teams to ensure baseline knowledge of those technologies and their attendant risks as part of Step 2 of the ENC method. Marrying ENC to existing practices. Every organization has a way of operating. A company has existing governance structures, policies, procedures, teams, and technologies. I've been referring to these things as resources of the organization. Implementing ENC teams thus requires a vision of how those teams integrate with those existing resources. There are two ways of understanding what this integration looks like. One is to understand how existing resources fold into the ENC approach. The other is to understand how the ENC approach folds into existing resources. Let's start with the first one. Folding existing resources into ENC teams. 3 existing resources can be helpful in integrating as part of your ENC process. Existing responsible AI, RAI, or AI ethical risk policies, existing RAI risk boards, and existing RAI frameworks. And a bonus, existing RAI software. We'll look at each in turn. Existing RAI policy. I explained in Chapter 4 why a responsible AI or AI ethics policy can't be the foundation of an efficient and effective approach to ethical nightmare avoidance. Am I against them as such? In principle, I am not. If the C suite or board level ENC team comes together, identifies nightmares, and decides that a crucial resource at their disposal is an enterprise wide policy, well, fine. I'm skeptical about what it can accomplish, unless, of course, the policy is to form ENC teams as needed. But whether to have a policy and what it should contain, once you've adopted the ENC approach, is a skirmish I would rather opt out of. For some organizations, it probably makes sense in some form or other, particularly for those that need to ban certain kinds of AI use. In other organizations, especially smaller ones like startups, it probably doesn't. The main point, though, is that we should see policies, whether they are AI specific or not, as one tool among many that organizations have at their disposal. And just like any tool, it may or may not make sense to use it. This means, among other things, that organizations with existing RAI policies do not need to start over or throw out their policy. It may well do a lot of good, important work. In that case, if there's an enterprise-wide policy, the ways that policy may be breached can simply be included among the identified nightmares in Step 3 of the ENC method. Integration is straightforward. Existing RAI risk boards. In Ethical Machines, I wrote about the importance of an AI ethics committee. And every organization I've worked with, and those I haven't, have some form of risk board to which teams escalate what they deem as high-risk AI. When it comes to narrow AI, which is the context in which I wrote that book, ethics committees made a lot of sense. They still make a lot of sense. But we need to rethink their place in the organization. They should be a backup when needed, not the default plan to address high-risk AI. The reason is simple. It's not scalable. As the quantity of AI use cases expands, the ethics committee cannot handle all of them. I have only ever seen ethics committees comprised primarily of senior-level personnel. They have their day jobs. Their committee work is a small fraction of what they do, and it cannot become their full-time jobs. And they need to be senior-level because they need the power and authority to veto projects or require effective risk mitigations to be introduced before the AI team is permitted to proceed to next stages. Further, in some cases, this committee must deal with AI that is procured from third parties. What's more, given the time it takes a committee of senior executives to become sufficiently knowledgeable about an AI use case, the ethics committee becomes a major bottleneck to innovation as various projects wait to be evaluated. On the other hand, project-level ENC teams handle the vast majority of nightmare identification, avoidance, detection, and emergency response, even for high-risk AI. If they cannot figure out how to sufficiently mitigate the risks, then it probably makes sense to cancel the project. If for some reason canceling the project is disastrous, then it probably makes sense to escalate to a group of senior executives that constitute an enterprise AI risk committee. But this is the exception to the rule that ENC teams are best positioned to evaluate AI use cases for potential nightmares and to devise appropriate strategies for nightmare avoidance and response. So don't disband your existing AI risk board. See them as one resource among many that has a place while also being easily overburdened and a bottleneck. Use it wisely. Existing RAI frameworks. Some organizations have developed frameworks or guidelines that they find useful for assessing AI risks. For instance, one client of mine likes to create frameworks that he then names with an acronym that spells out a kind of animal, the WOLF framework for AI agents, for example. Other organizations have less fanciful frameworks that deal with issues pertaining to fairness or explainability or privacy. How do such frameworks fit within the Ethical Nightmare Challenge? There are two ways to proceed here. The first is to simply take those guides' decisions trees as among the resources your organization uses to avoid ethical nightmares. They are some of the answers to the second question of the Ethical Nightmare Challenge. The second way is to simply let them go. For instance, instead of having a special framework or deliberative guide for thinking about the risks that pertain to agentic AI by virtue of their autonomy, you can just 1. Identify what kinds of ethical nightmares are relevant to different levels of autonomy. For example, the extent to which the agent checks in with a person before it takes additional steps, and what the probability of those nightmares occurring is. 2. Identify and or build the resources needed for avoiding and detecting those ethical nightmares related to each level of autonomy. One useful thing to do here is to determine milestones that AI may reach, such that you feel comfortable enhancing its autonomy. 3. Train the people who will oversee the low, medium, high autonomous agents. Unsurprisingly, this second approach is my preferred way of going about things. We don't need special frameworks and deliberative guides for autonomy and privacy and hallucinations, and we just need to see that autonomy can be a source of ethical nightmares, along with cascading failures, systemic risks, etc. And so it's something we need to pay attention to when we're identifying and scoring ethical nightmares in Part 3 of the 7-step ENC method. Existing RAI software. One more note on resources I haven't discussed yet: AI governance or responsible AI software. Some of that software is for data scientists to use at the model or solution level. For instance, there is software that assesses for bias or the rate of hallucination of an AI. Some software scans for sensitive data a user may input into the system via a prompt, while other software may scan for sensitive data among the AI outputs. There's also risk and compliance software that may help companies track their inventory of AI throughout their enterprise, as well as the extent to which those models comply with regulations and/or internal policy. In some cases, this kind of software comes from third-party vendors that specialize in responsible AI. In other cases, in fact, in most cases with my clients, existing governance, risk, and compliance software is used and modified to include responsible AI requirements. There are two things to note here. First, software solutions are important resources. They are the kinds of resources that should be identified by an enterprise and/or department ENC team, keeping in mind that project-level leaders should serve on those teams so they can provide their on-the-ground insights into what is needed and what will work. Second, these solutions are never the entirety of the solution. As I hope to have demonstrated by now, nightmare avoidance is an exceedingly complex affair, and no software, no matter how impressive it is, can handle all the nightmare avoidance. Anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to tell you something. Probably AI governance software. Third, that software is a tool, a means to an end. It cannot tell you what the end is. On the other hand, the ENC approach starts with the end. It is an outcome-oriented approach, as we've now discussed ad nauseum. The ENC approach thus gives you a basis on which to assess the utility of various software options. Would use of X software bring nightmare scores down in a meaningful way? If yes, sounds like, all else equal, such as cost, you've got a good solution on your hands. If not, don't waste your money. Folding ENC teams into existing resources. The ENC approach is laser-focused on building the organizational capacity to avoid nightmares at scale. In my estimation, it is the only viable method for this task. All existing alternatives, including the ones my team and I have built, pale in comparison in every respect. ENC teams do not, however, do everything that needs to be done from an AI governance perspective. After all, at least in larger organizations, there are existing risk functions that can and should play a role. I'm thinking here of things like internal audit teams, legal and compliance teams, and executives who are responsible for giving the final green light. ENC teams do not replace their important work. Internal compliance and audit teams, at a minimum, verify that the 7-step ENC method was carried out and documented. Above that, they can answer qualitative questions. Did they identify the relevant nightmare scenarios or skip uncomfortable questions? Did they implement the resources they documented? Are their metrics meaningful or cosmetic? Legal and compliance teams assess whether the nightmare-avoiding resources that were deployed are sufficient for regulatory compliance and commensurate with the organization's legal risk appetite. This is made easier if someone from legal, risk, or compliance served on the project-level ENC team. Senior executives provide the green light after reviewing ENC team efforts and the approvals of audit, legal, and compliance. ENC teams don't only integrate with these functions, though. They make those jobs easier in two respects. First, by doing the heavy lifting of nightmare identification and avoidance themselves, and second, by doing it in a way that consistently creates the sort of documentation those functions review. Consider what typically happens today when legal or compliance gets involved with AI. They're brought in late, often when a project is nearly ready to deploy, and asked, "Hey, is this compliant?" Same goes for cybersecurity teams. "We're shipping this next week. Can you make sure it's secure?" They're forced to make quick judgments about technologies they may not fully understand, in contexts where the full scope of risks may not have been systematically identified. They become bottlenecks not because they're slow or bureaucratic. Okay, fine, not only because they're slow or bureaucratic, but because they're being asked to assess risks that should have been identified and mitigated much earlier in the development process. ENC teams flip this dynamic. Because project-level ENC teams are identifying nightmares from the beginning of development, and because these teams often include members from legal, compliance, and privacy, risk identification happens early and systematically. By the time a project reaches the point where it needs formal compliance review, ethical nightmare scenarios have already been scored, mitigated, and rescored. Audit, compliance, etc. teams aren't scrambling to understand what could go wrong. They're validating that the preventive measures are adequate. Note, though, that members of risk functions who serve on a project-level ENC team cannot also be part of the risk team that validates their work. Otherwise, you have the fox guarding the henhouse. Finally, while project-level ENC teams are overseen by existing risk functions, as ENC maturity grows and ENC teams consistently prove themselves capable, increased responsibilities and authority can be granted to them. Perhaps in early days, all ENC-generated materials are reviewed. Perhaps in middle days, those materials are randomly audited. Perhaps in much later days, they can greenlight AI use cases and deployments themselves. In other words, the degree of autonomy and authority granted to ENC teams can evolve as ENC maturity increases. Come to think of it, I suggest a nested modification of the ENC framework for ENC maturity. 1. Identify what kinds of ethical nightmares are relevant to each level of autonomy, for example, the extent to which the ENC teams must check in with managers or executives before taking additional steps, and what the probability of those nightmares occurring is. 2. Identify what resources you have or will build for avoiding and detecting those ethical nightmares related to each level of ENC autonomy. One important resource here would be determining milestones that ENC teams may reach, such that the organization is comfortable enhancing its autonomy. 3. Identify what training is needed by those people overseeing the low, medium, high autonomous ENC teams. Perhaps I should have titled this chapter, Fun with Fractals. I wonder if I can get the cover of the book to represent repeating patterns. The Ethical Nightmare Challenge for Everyone. Throughout the last chapter in this one, I've focused on the Ethical Nightmare Challenge as it pertains to ENC teams, and I've been particularly focused on explaining how ENC teams at different levels support each other so that AI project teams can successfully engage in ethical nightmare avoidance, detection, and response. But I have not addressed two crucial aspects of AI in organizations. First, for all AI, but especially for generative and agentic AI, a huge part of what explains why the AI generates the outputs that it does is the prompt that a user creates for it. I refer to this as so many prompts in Chapter 2. Data scientists and ENC teams can do all sorts of nightmare avoidance, but if the user of the AI is intent on relying on hallucinations, doesn't vet for biased outputs, or is overly deferential to the AI, I'm afraid those end users may well succeed in giving life to a nightmare. Second, AI is increasingly embedded in everyone's workflow. Most of the contact people have with AI is not playing a role in developing it, but in using it. More specifically, they're using AI to help them with their non-AI specific projects. When you combine these two facts, you get headlines like, quote, Deloitte was caught using AI in a $290,000 report to help the Australian government crack down on welfare after a researcher flagged hallucinations, end quote. With article summaries like, quote, Deloitte's member firm in Australia will pay the government a partial refund for a $290,000 report that contained alleged AI-generated errors, including references to non-existent academic research papers and a fabricated quote from a federal court judgment, end quote. We find similar headlines in other industries. Quote, trouble with AI hallucinations spreads to big law firms, end quote. What we really get when we combine these two aspects of AI use is that the Ethical Nightmare Challenge doesn't only apply to developing AI. It means that employees and teams that are working on any project in which AI will be used also need to take care to avoid AI's ethical nightmares. This doesn't mean that every project team should engage in the 7-step method. That's too cumbersome and time-consuming. Instead, as part of the kickoff of every project, the team and/or members of the team should answer the following. 1. What ethical nightmares must be avoided that pertain to our use of AI in this project? 2. What are the resources we have to avoid those nightmares? 3. What training, if any, is needed to use those resources? Suppose the aforementioned Deloitte member firm had gone through this process prior to their work for the Australian government. They could have easily walked out of a 15-minute meeting thinking, 1. We must avoid the ethical nightmare of blindly relying on AI outputs given the known threat of hallucinations, since we'll be using AI to perform basic research throughout this project. 2. We can fact-check ourselves by verifying relevant information without using AI, and/or we can run this report by relevant subject matter experts to verify the claims. 3. No special training for this is needed over and above the baseline training we've already received. Later in the project, they can ask themselves whether they executed on 2. If no, get on it. If yes, great. You just avoided a couple $100,000 in losses and the reputational damage that resulted from dozens of headlines plastered across LinkedIn thousands of times, not to mention your peers and a certain bestseller book. This is the elegant simplicity of the Ethical Nightmare Challenge. It works for developing and deploying AI. It works for executives, department heads, and AI project leaders. It even works for every employee in everyday projects. This is how you create a culture of ethical nightmare avoidance. It's how you create the organizational capacity to build and use AI at scale. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wasilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.